Have you ever imagined that the way Filipinos speak English might sound more authentic to William Shakespeare than the voices echoing through modern London? Absurd, right? Yet, one quiet afternoon in Manila, a Cambridge linguist named Professor James Whitaker would begin to doubt everything he thought he knew about his own language. Whitaker was known for his precision, a man who studied how English changed through centuries, from royal courts to modern slang. But when he sat in the back of a university classroom in Quezon City, something inside him shifted. Students were reading lines from Hamlet, and their voices carried a rhythm, a melody, a reverence that felt ancient. He whispered to his assistant later, "They sound more like the England I read about than the one I live in." That sentence would become the spark that changed his life, and the way the world viewed Filipino English. Whitaker began recording ordinary conversations. A tricycle driver talking to a teacher, a nurse giving instructions, a priest delivering a sermon. The tone fascinated him, dignified, balanced, almost musical. It wasn't American, it wasn't British, it was something else, something older. Late one night, walking through the quiet streets of Intramuros, he finally wrote in his notebook, "Filipino English doesn't sound colonial, it sounds ancestral." He didn't know it yet, but he had just uncovered a truth that would challenge centuries of English pride. Whitaker's curiosity grew into obsession. He met Clara Reyes, a young Filipino linguist who became his guide through Manila's classrooms and churches. One morning, after hearing a priest recite the gospel in English, Whitaker sat speechless. The tone was biblical, yet intimate. He asked Clara, "Why does it sound so different here?" She smiled. "Maybe because we speak English not as conquerors, but as believers." Those words haunted him. In Britain, English was a tool. In the Philippines, it was a bridge, a language of empathy. He spent weeks recording voices, from call centers to fishing villages, discovering the same rhythm everywhere. Slow, clear, sincere, every vowel respected, every word balanced. Then one day a boy named Neo told him, "I like English, sir, so I can talk to anyone, even people I don't know." That line pierced Whitaker's heart. In London, accent divided class. Here, it connected souls. At dinner that night, Clara shared her grandmother's story, a woman who prayed in English because during the war, it made her feel close to God. That was when Whitaker realized this wasn't about grammar or accent. It was about spirit. Weeks turned into months. Whitaker's notebook overflowed with notes, sketches, and sound waves. He played recordings late into the night, Filipino voices reading Shakespeare, prayers, classroom dialogues, and compared them with ancient archives from the Globe Theatre in London. To his disbelief, the rhythm patterns aligned almost perfectly. The tone rose and fell with grace, the pauses were intentional, and every word carried emotion before precision. It wasn't mimicry, it was muscle memory, the kind that only comes from generations of respect for the spoken word. One afternoon, in a dusty university lab in Manila, he called out to Clara, his voice shaking, "Clara, listen to this." He played two clips, one from a Shakespearean historian reciting Sonnet 18, the other from a Filipino teacher reading the same lines. When the Filipino recording ended, Clara whispered, "It sounds like it was written for us." A week later, Whitaker shared his findings with colleagues in London through a private academic forum. Some laughed. Others accused him of romanticizing a colonial accent. But a few, especially theatre experts, were intrigued. One of them, a veteran Shakespeare actor named Thomas Bentley, asked, "Send me one of those recordings, will you?" When he listened, he reportedly sat in silence before saying, "It feels like I'm hearing the words as they were meant to be spoken." Bentley flew to Manila. Together they organized an informal reading at an old convent in Intramuros. Filipino literature students sat across from British actors. They decided to perform Romeo and Juliet, alternating lines. When Juliet's turn came, A Filipino student named Mara stood. Her voice trembled, but it was filled with sincerity. "My bounty is as boundless as the sea." Her tone was soft, reverent, almost like prayer. When the British student replied, his delivery was skilled, but hurried, polished, yet somehow hollow. The room went silent. Bentley turned to Whitaker and whispered, "They're not performing it, James. They're believing it." That evening, as the sun set behind the convent walls, Whitaker wrote, "England perfected the language. The Philippines protected its soul." He didn't know it yet, but the world was about to hear that sentence echo far beyond the classroom walls. When Whitaker returned to Britain, his quiet research exploded into controversy. British tabloids mocked him with headlines like, "Cambridge professor claims Filipinos speak truer English than the British." Social media buzzed with ridicule and debate. But Whitaker stayed silent until he was invited to speak at the British Academy of Linguistics, the most prestigious and skeptical stage in the country. On that cold London evening, the hall was filled with professors, historians, and journalists. He stood at the podium, hands trembling slightly. Behind him glowed two spectrograms, one labeled Modern London Speech, the other Filipino English, Manila Sample. He pressed play. First came the London clip, quick, clipped, full of interruptions and self-assurance. Then came the Filipino recording, a teacher reading Shakespeare's Sonnet 18, her voice steady, graceful, filled with warmth. When the last note faded, the silence that followed was heavy, almost reverent. Whitaker spoke softly, "This is not coincidence, it is continuity. The Philippines has kept what we lost, the moral rhythm of English." A senior scholar stood up, his voice sharp. "Professor, are you suggesting that an ex-colony preserved our heritage better than we did?" Whitaker looked him in the eye. "No," he replied quietly. "I'm saying they cherished it more than we ever did." Gasps filled the room. Some laughed bitterly, others simply stared. But Whitaker continued. "In London, English became a race, faster, louder, cleverer. In Manila, it became a prayer, slower, kinder, truer." When his talk ended, there was no applause, just silence. And in that silence, truth echoed louder than clapping ever could. The next morning, the video of his speech went viral. Filipino teachers, nurses, and students across the world shared it with pride. A call center agent in Dubai wrote, "For once, someone saw what we feel every day." A teacher in Davao posted, "We speak English not to sound foreign, but to be understood." For Whitaker, this was no longer research. It was redemption, for a language that had forgotten its own heart. Months later, Whitaker and Clara were invited to the Global English Symposium in Singapore, a gathering of the world's top linguists and educators. The theme, the future of English. When Whitaker stepped on stage, he began with a single question that silenced the hall. What if the future of English isn't in London or New York, but in Manila? The audience murmured. He smiled faintly and continued, "In Britain, English became a language of progress. In the Philippines, it remains a language of purpose." Then he turned to Clara. She took the microphone, her voice calm but trembling with emotion. "We Filipinos," she said, "did not inherit English to imitate the West. We embraced it to tell our own stories, with faith, humility, and heart. Maybe that's why it still sounds like Shakespeare, because we never stopped believing in meaning." The hall erupted in applause, not polite clapping. Thunderous, heartfelt, almost tearful. Even a few British delegates stood up in quiet respect. Afterward, a professor from Oxford shook Whitaker's hand and said softly, "Perhaps it's time we start learning English from them." Whitaker smiled. "That's exactly what I've been saying." Weeks later, Whitaker returned to Manila to receive a Cultural Recognition Award. Standing before hundreds of Filipino teachers, he began, "I came to your country to study English, but what I discovered was something far greater. You have preserved not only a language, but its soul." He paused. "That's why Shakespeare would have understood you better than us." The hall fell silent, then erupted in warm, emotional applause. An elderly teacher approached him and said, "Thank you, Professor. You made us proud of something we never thought was ours to keep." Whitaker replied gently, "No, ma'am, you didn't keep it. You carried it and gave it back to the world." That night he walked alone by Manila Bay. The lights shimmered across the water, the air thick with sea breeze and roasted corn. He whispered, "Maybe the British Empire didn't teach the Philippines English. Maybe the Philippines taught us what English was meant to mean." The next morning, before his flight, he visited a small public school. Children were rehearsing The Tempest. Their accents were imperfect, their voices trembling, but full of life. When one little girl ran up and asked, "Sir, did we say it right?" he smiled through tears. "You said it perfectly," he whispered. "Better than anyone I know." As he boarded his plane, he wrote the last line of his research. The English language was born in England, but it was reborn with heart and faith in the Philippines. And for the first time in his life, he believed that maybe the truest guardians of history aren't those who write it, but those who speak it with love. On his last day, Whitaker attended a Manila graduation. The valedictorian's English was flawless, heartfelt, and sincere. He realized Filipinos hadn't just preserved the sounds of English, they'd preserved its soul. Shakespeare's language was built for emotion, and here it was still alive. In his closing remarks, Whitaker said, "I believed the purest English was spoken in Cambridge or London. I was wrong. The purest English with the most heart and soul is spoken here." The audience erupted in a standing ovation. Whitaker left transformed, from observer to humble student. He learned that language's value is measured by love and respect, not geography. As his plane took off, he knew the truest English had found a new home. In the Philippines, the ghost of Shakespeare was not just a memory, but a living presence. And the world would never see English the same way again.